He could buy everything, except what he wanted most, her heart. He could buy anything in this world. Private islands, Fortune 500 companies, politicians, silence. But there was one thing his billions couldn't purchase. One thing that drove him to the edge of madness every single night as he stared at the ceiling of his penthouse. The woman who looked at him like he was absolutely nothing. Her name was Catherine Hayes, and she was about to teach the most powerful man in New York that some things in life can't be owned, can't be controlled, and can't be bought. This is the story of how a man who had everything lost himself, completely trying to win the heart of the only woman who ever told him no. The first time Jonathan Pierce saw Catherine Hayes, she was throwing a glass of champagne in someone's face. Not his face, thankfully, but close enough that a few drops landed on his $1,000 tie. It was at the Metropolitan Museum's annual gala, the kind of event where Manhattan's elite gathered to pretend they cared about art while actually networking and showing off their wealth. Jonathan had been standing near the marble columns, bored out of his mind, listening to a tech entrepreneur drone on about his latest acquisition, when he heard the sharp crack of glass hitting the floor and a woman's voice cutting through the classical music like a blade. "Keep your hands to yourself, or next time it won't be champagne," she said, her voice steady and cold as winter steel. Jonathan turned to see her. This woman in a simple black dress that probably cost a tenth of what every other woman in the room was wearing. Her dark auburn hair pulled back in a way that seemed almost defiant of the elaborate updos surrounding her, and her green eyes blazing with a fire that made something in his chest tighten. The man she'd just humiliated was Gerald Hutchinson, a hedge fund manager known for his wandering hands and his wife's willingness to look the other way. Gerald stood there, champagne dripping from his jowls, his face turning an impressive shade of purple. "Do you know who I am?" Gerald sputtered, which Jonathan always found to be the most pathetic question a rich man could ask. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile a wolf might give before going in for the kill. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Hutchinson. You're the man who just grabbed my assistant's backside and is about to have a very interesting conversation with your wife, who I believe is standing right over there by the Monet exhibit. Should I call her over, or would you prefer to slink away quietly?" Gerald's eyes widened, and without another word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd like the coward he was. The woman smoothed down her dress, picked up another glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and took a sip as if nothing had happened. Jonathan found himself walking toward her before he'd even made the conscious decision to move. "Well, that was impressive," he said. And she turned to look at him with those remarkable green eyes that seemed to see right through the expensive suit and the carefully maintained image to something underneath that made him uncomfortable. "Was it?" she asked, her tone suggesting she didn't particularly care about his opinion. "I thought it was just basic human decency." Standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves in a room full of people who would rather pretend they didn't see anything. There was an accusation in her words, and Jonathan felt it land. He'd seen Gerald's harassment, and he'd done nothing. Just like everyone else in this room, he'd looked away because it wasn't his problem, because getting involved would be awkward, because men like Gerald had connections that could be useful. "You're right," he said, and the admission seemed to surprise her. Her eyebrows raised slightly, and for a moment, her guard dropped just enough for him to see genuine curiosity. "I'm Jonathan Pierce." He extended his hand, and she looked at it for a long moment before taking it. Her handshake was firm, professional, the kind that suggested she'd had to prove herself in rooms full of men who underestimated her. "Catherine Hayes." "I run the Hayes Foundation." Jonathan knew the name. The Hayes Foundation was a nonprofit that provided legal services and job training for women escaping domestic violence. It was small, scrappy, and had a reputation for taking on powerful abusers that bigger organizations wouldn't touch. "I've heard of your work," he said. "It's admirable." She pulled her hand back and took another sip of champagne, her expression cooling again. Admirable. That's what people say when they want to compliment something without actually supporting it. Tell me, Mr. Pierce, when was the last time you donated to a cause that didn't come with a tax break and a photo opportunity? The question was direct, almost rude, and Jonathan felt a flash of irritation mixed with something else, something that felt dangerously like excitement. No one talked to him like this. No one questioned his motives or challenged him to his face. People wanted things from him, access, money, connections, and they played the game accordingly. But this woman, Catherine Hayes, she looked at him like he was just another obstacle in her path. Another wealthy man who thought his checkbook made him important. Fair point, he said, surprising himself again. What if I wanted to change that? What if I wanted to actually support your foundation? No photos, no publicity? Catherine studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being dissected, examined, and found wanting. Then I'd say you should visit our website and make a donation like everyone else. We don't need a white knight, Mr. Pierce. We need systemic change, and that requires more than one rich man's guilty conscience. She set down her empty glass and turned to leave. But Jonathan caught her arm gently. She looked down at his hand and then back up at his face, and the ice in her eyes could have frozen the sun. I wasn't finished talking to you, he said, and immediately regretted it when he saw her expression harden further. But I was finished talking to you, she said quietly, pulling her arm free. You see, Mr. Pierce, I've met 100 men like you. Men who think that because they have money and power, they're entitled to whatever they want, including other people's time and attention. I'm not interested in being another acquisition in your portfolio. I'm not interested in your charity that comes with strings attached. And I'm definitely not interested in whatever game you think you're playing right now. She walked away, leaving Jonathan standing alone by the marble columns, feeling something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Rejection. Complete, unambiguous rejection. And it ignited something in him that he didn't fully understand. A need to prove her wrong, to show her that he wasn't like other men, that he was different, special, worth her time. That night, lying in his king-sized bed in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about Catherine Hayes and the way she'd looked at him. Like he was nothing. Like his wealth and power and influence meant absolutely nothing to her. He pulled out his phone and started researching the Hayes Foundation, reading every article, every interview, every piece of information he could find about the woman who had dismissed him so thoroughly. Catherine Hayes, 32 years old, former corporate lawyer who'd left a partnership track position at a white shoe law firm to start her foundation. She'd grown up in Pittsburgh, daughter of a steel worker and a nurse, first in her family to go to college. She'd put herself through law school working 3 jobs, graduated top of her class, and then walked away from a 7-figure salary to help women who couldn't pay her a dime. The more Jonathan read, the more fascinated he became. This wasn't just some bleeding heart do-gooder. Catherine Hayes was strategic, brilliant, and absolutely uncompromising in her mission. She'd taken on Fortune 500 companies for workplace harassment, battled with politicians who wanted to defund women's shelters, and won case after case that everyone told her was unwinnable. She was a force of nature wrapped in a deceptively simple black dress, and Jonathan wanted her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But he knew, with a certainty that made his chest tight, that the usual playbook wouldn't work here. He couldn't wine and dine his way into her life. He couldn't buy her affection with jewelry and exotic vacations. Catherine Hayes despised everything he represented, and if he wanted even a chance with her, he would have to become someone different, someone worthy. The question was whether he even knew how to be that person anymore. Jonathan's first attempt to connect with Catherine came 3 days after the gala. He'd made an anonymous donation to the Hayes Foundation, a substantial one, and then arranged to volunteer at one of their job training workshops. He showed up in jeans and a plain shirt, trying to look casual and approachable, and found himself in a community center in the Bronx that was about as far from his usual environment as Mars. The workshop was teaching resume writing and interview skills to women who were rebuilding their lives, and Jonathan had thought he could help, that his experience in business would be valuable. He was wrong. Catherine spotted him immediately. She was standing at the front of the room, setting up a projector, when he walked in, and her expression went from neutral to distinctly unwelcoming in about half a second. She excused herself from the group she was working with and walked over to him, her arms crossed over her chest. "What are you doing here?" she asked. And there was no warmth in her voice, no pleasant surprise, just suspicion. "I'm here to volunteer," Jonathan said, trying to sound genuine. "I saw your website, read about the programs, and I thought I could help." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "Really?" Jonathan Pierce, billionaire CEO, wants to spend his Tuesday evening teaching resume writing in the Bronx. Forgive me if I find that hard to believe. "Why is it so hard to believe that I might want to give back?" Jonathan asked, feeling his defensiveness rise. "Because men like you don't just give back," Catherine said bluntly. "You take, and when you do give, it's always with an agenda. So tell me, what's yours?" "Are you here to ease your conscience, to have a story to tell at your next cocktail party about how you're helping the little people? Or is this about me?" The last question hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation and understanding. Jonathan wanted to lie, to tell her she was being paranoid, but something in her eyes made him tell the truth. "Maybe it's a little bit about you," he admitted. "I can't stop thinking about what you said at the gala, about me being like every other rich man you've met. I want to prove you wrong." Catherine laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You want to prove me wrong? So this is about your ego. That's even worse than I thought." She turned to walk away, but Jonathan followed her. "What would it take?" he asked. "What would it take for you to give me a chance?" "Not as a donor, not as some wealthy benefactor, but as a person. What would I have to do?" Catherine stopped and turned back to face him, and for a moment he saw something flicker across her face, something that looked almost like sadness. "You want to know what it would take?" she asked quietly. "It would take you becoming someone completely different, someone who understands what it's like to have nothing. Someone who knows that money can't solve every problem and power can't control every outcome. Someone who sees people, really sees them, instead of viewing them as assets or obstacles or opportunities." "Then teach me," Jonathan said, and the words came out before he'd fully thought them through. "Let me volunteer here, really volunteer, not as some publicity stunt but as someone who wants to learn. Teach me what you see that I don't." Catherine studied him for a long moment, and Jonathan held his breath, waiting. "Fine," she finally said. "But there are rules. 1, you don't get special treatment. You're here to help, not to be helped. 2, you don't talk about who you are or what you do. These women don't need to know they're being taught by a billionaire, and honestly, it would make them uncomfortable. 3, you actually listen and learn instead of assuming you already know everything. And 4, the second I think you're wasting our time or using this as some elaborate pickup attempt, you're gone. Understood?" "Understood," Jonathan said, and something in his chest loosened. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next several weeks, Jonathan threw himself into volunteering at the Hayes Foundation with a dedication that surprised even him. He showed up every Tuesday and Thursday evening, helping with resume workshops, mock interviews, and job placement programs. He listened to the stories of women who had escaped abusive relationships, who had fought their way out of poverty, who had rebuilt their lives from nothing. And slowly, painfully, He began to understand what Catherine had been trying to tell him that night at the gala. These women didn't need his pity or his charity. They needed opportunity, respect, and someone to believe in them. They needed systemic change, not individual saviors. And they taught him more about courage and resilience than he'd learned in all his years of business school and boardroom battles. He saw the way Catherine worked with them, the way she treated each woman with dignity and fierce protection, the way she fought for them against employers who tried to lowball them or landlords who tried to cheat them. She was extraordinary, and the more time Jonathan spent around her, the more he realized that his initial attraction had been shallow, surface level. What he felt now was deeper, more profound, and infinitely more dangerous. One evening, about 2 months into his volunteering, Jonathan was helping a woman named Linda prepare for an interview at a marketing firm. Linda was in her late 40s, had escaped an abusive marriage 3 years earlier, and was trying to re-enter the workforce after 20 years as a stay-at-home mother. She was brilliant but terrified, convinced that no one would hire her because of the gap in her resume. Jonathan spent 2 hours with her, helping her see that raising 4 children while managing a household was actually extraordinary project management experience. He helped her frame her volunteer work at her church as community outreach and event planning. And when they finished, Linda had tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, squeezing his hand. "And you made me feel like I actually have something to offer." Jonathan felt something crack inside his chest, some hard shell of cynicism and self-protection that he'd built up over years of cutthroat business dealings. "You have everything to offer," he said, and meant it. After Linda left, Jonathan found Catherine watching him from across the room. She'd been observing the whole session, and when their eyes met, he couldn't quite read her expression. She walked over to him, and for once, she didn't look angry or suspicious. She looked thoughtful. "That was good work," she said simply. "Linda's been struggling with her confidence. You helped her see herself differently." It was the first real compliment she'd given him, and Jonathan felt absurdly pleased. "And she's remarkable," he said. "They all are." "Yes, they are," Catherine agreed. And then, after a pause, "You've surprised me, Jonathan. I didn't think you'd last a week. And here you are, 2 months in, actually making a difference." It wasn't a declaration of love or even friendship, but it felt like progress. Jonathan smiled. "Does this mean you might be willing to have coffee with me?" "Just coffee, as 2 people who work together." Catherine considered this for a moment. "Coffee," she finally said. "But you're buying, and I'm choosing the place. And if you try to turn it into something it's not, I'm leaving." "Deal," Jonathan said, trying not to look too triumphant. Their first coffee happened on a Saturday morning at a diner in Queens that Catherine claimed had the best pancakes in New York. Jonathan, who usually had his assistant bring him a green smoothie and egg white omelet from an organic cafe that charged $20 for breakfast, found himself in a cracked vinyl booth eating pancakes that were drowning in syrup and were absolutely delicious. Catherine showed up in jeans and a sweater, her hair down for the first time since he'd met her, and Jonathan thought she'd never looked more beautiful. They talked for 3 hours. Catherine told him about growing up in Pittsburgh, about her father who'd worked in the steel mills until they closed, and her mother who'd picked up double shifts at the hospital to make ends meet. She told him about being the first in her family to go to college, about the scholarship that made it possible and the jobs she'd worked to cover what the scholarship didn't. She told him about law school, about the moment she realized that corporate law was slowly killing her soul, and about the woman who'd changed everything. Her name had been Jennifer, and she'd been a paralegal at Catherine's firm. Jennifer's husband had been beating her for years, but she stayed because she had 2 kids and nowhere to go. One day, she showed up to work with a broken arm and a bruised face, and when Catherine asked what happened, Jennifer broke down. She told Catherine everything, how her husband controlled all the money, how he'd threatened to take the kids if she left, how she felt trapped with no way out. Catherine had helped her, connected her with resources. helped her find a lawyer who would work pro bono. And when Jennifer finally escaped and rebuilt her life, she told Catherine, "You saved me. You gave me back my life." "That's when I knew," Catherine said, stirring her coffee. "That's when I knew that this was what I was supposed to be doing. Not helping rich corporations get richer, but helping women like Jennifer who actually needed help. My parents thought I was crazy, walking away from all that money, but they understood. They'd spent their whole lives working hard for not enough, and they got that some things matter more than a paycheck." Jonathan listened, and something inside him shifted. He'd spent his entire adult life chasing money and power, believing that they were the only things that mattered, that they were what defined success. But sitting in this diner, listening to Catherine talk about purpose and meaning, he realized how empty his life had been. How much he'd been missing. "What about you?" Catherine asked. "What's your story? And I don't mean the Forbes profile version. I mean the real story. Why did you become who you are?" It was a fair question, and Jonathan found himself wanting to answer honestly, even though it meant revealing parts of himself he usually kept hidden. "I grew up poor too," he said, and Catherine's eyebrows rose in surprise. "And not as poor as some, but we struggled. My dad was a teacher, my mom was a secretary, and there were 4 of us kids in a 3-bedroom house. I wore hand-me-downs, worked at McDonald's starting when I was 15, and got into college on student loans that took me 10 years to pay off." "So what happened?" Catherine asked. "When did you become the man who stands in museum galas looking bored while predators assault women?" The question was harsh but not unfair, and Jonathan flinched. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "Somewhere along the way, I decided that I never wanted to feel powerless again. I never wanted to worry about money or status or whether I was good enough. So I worked, harder than anyone else, longer than anyone else, and I climbed. I made my first million by 28, my first 100 million by 35, and with the money came power, and with the power came this distance between me and everyone else. I stopped seeing people as people and started seeing them as transactions, useful or not useful, assets or liabilities." "That's honest," Catherine said, and there was something in her voice that might have been respect. "But here's my question. Now that you've seen it, now that you've admitted it, what are you going to do about it?" Jonathan met her eyes across the table. "I'm going to change," he said. "I'm going to be better. I'm going to be someone you might actually want to know." Catherine smiled, a real smile this time, small and hesitant but genuine. "That's a good answer," she said. "But talk is cheap, Jonathan. Show me." And showing her became Jonathan's entire focus, his mission, his obsession. If you're enjoying this story of transformation and the power of real connection, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss what happens next when Jonathan's past comes crashing back in a way that threatens everything he's building with Catherine. For the next 6 months, Jonathan transformed his life in ways he never thought possible. He scaled back his hours at Pierce Industries, delegating more to his executive team and focusing his energy on the work that actually mattered. He continued volunteering at the Hayes Foundation, expanding his role to include fundraising and board development. He used his connections, but differently than before. Instead of collecting favors and obligations, he connected people who could genuinely help each other, who shared values and vision. And slowly, carefully, his relationship with Catherine deepened. They fell into a routine of Saturday morning breakfasts at the diner in Queens, long walks through Central Park where they'd talk about everything from politics to poetry, and occasional dinners at small restaurants that Catherine chose, places where the food was good and the atmosphere was unpretentious. Jonathan learned that Catherine was funny, with a dry wit that could make him laugh until his sides hurt. He learned that she was vulnerable too, beneath all that armor, that she carried the weight of every woman she couldn't save, every case she lost, every system she couldn't change. One night, about 8 months after they'd met, Catherine called him at midnight. Jonathan was in bed, reading through quarterly reports, when his phone rang. I lost one, she said, her voice rough with tears. Amanda. I told you about her. Remember? The one with 3 kids and the husband who kept violating the restraining order. He found her tonight, put her in the hospital. She's going to live, but... Her voice broke, and Jonathan was up and dressed before he'd even consciously decided to move. Where are you? He asked. The office, she said. I can't go home yet. I can't just... I can't... I'm coming, Jonathan said. And 20 minutes later, he was unlocking the door to the Hayes Foundation's small office space with the key Catherine had given him a month ago. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her face streaked with tears. Jonathan sat down beside her, not saying anything, just being there. After a long silence, Catherine spoke. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it, she said quietly. If anything we do actually matters, we help one woman escape, and then 10 more show up. We change one policy, and they find a loophole. We win one case, and lose 3 more. And then nights like tonight happen. And I think about Amanda and her kids, and I wonder if I'm just fooling myself. If I'm just putting Band-Aids on a problem that's too big to fix. Jonathan took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. You saved Jennifer, he said, and Linda is starting her new job next week because of you, and there are dozens, maybe hundreds of women who are alive and free and building new lives because you didn't give up. You can't save everyone, Catherine. Nobody can. But you save the ones you can, and that matters. It matters more than anything. Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time, 2 people trying to fight against the darkness, trying to make the world a little bit better, a little bit safer, a little bit more just. When Catherine finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared that if I let you in, really let you in, you'll leave. Or you'll change back into who you were. Or you'll realize that this life, this work, this endless fight, it's too much, too hard, too draining. Jonathan turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I know I was a different person when we met. I know I was everything you despised. But you changed me, Catherine. You showed me what actually matters, what's actually worth fighting for. And I'm not walking away from that. I'm not walking away from you. She kissed him then, soft and tentative at first, then deeper, with all the pent-up emotion and longing of the past 8 months. And Jonathan felt something in his chest expand, something huge and terrifying and wonderful. And he knew with absolute certainty that he was in love with Catherine Hayes, that he had been for months, that he would be for the rest of his life. They spent that night together, talking until the sun came up, and in the morning, Catherine looked at him with eyes that were no longer guarded, no longer suspicious, but open and vulnerable and trusting. I think I might be falling in love with you, she said, and that terrifies me. I'm already there, Jonathan admitted. I'm completely, terrifyingly in love with you, and I know I don't deserve you. I know I spent most of my life being exactly the kind of man you hate, but I swear to you, Catherine, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you, trying to be the man you see when you look at me now. Catherine smiled, that real, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. You're already him, she said. You just had to find him again. For 3 months, Jonathan lived in a state of happiness he hadn't known was possible. He and Catherine were inseparable, partners in every sense of the word. He helped her with the foundation. She challenged him to be better in his business dealings. They moved in together, into Catherine's modest apartment rather than his penthouse because she'd looked at the marble and glass and said it felt like a museum, not a home. Jonathan found himself cooking dinner with her in the cramped kitchen, watching terrible reality TV on her worn couch, falling asleep to the sound of her breathing. He was happier in that tiny apartment, than he'd ever been in his penthouse overlooking Central Park. He was more himself with Catherine than he'd been with anyone in his entire life. And then, 3 months into their relationship, everything fell apart. It started with a phone call from his CFO. There was a problem with one of Pierce Industries' overseas operations, a factory in Bangladesh that manufactured textiles for their clothing line. Reports were coming in about unsafe working conditions, underpaid workers, and child labor violations. The media was starting to ask questions, and shareholders were getting nervous. Jonathan's first instinct was to handle it the way he always had. Deploy the lawyers, settle quickly and quietly, bury the story with NDAs and hush money. It was standard operating procedure in corporate America, the cost of doing business. But then he thought about Catherine, about the women at the foundation, about the person he was trying to become, and he knew he couldn't do it the same way anymore. He flew to Bangladesh to see the factory himself, against the advice of his legal team and his board. What he found there made him physically sick. Children as young as 10 working 16-hour shifts in rooms with no ventilation. Women being paid pennies an hour for work that Pierce Industries turned into million-dollar profits. Safety violations that had already led to injuries and deaths that the factory owners had covered up. Jonathan shut down the factory immediately and started an investigation into all of Pierce Industries' overseas operations. He discovered a rot that went deep, a systematic exploitation that had been happening for years under the guise of competitive pricing and profit maximization. It was everything Catherine despised about corporate America, and it had been happening under his watch, funded by his company, contributing to his wealth. When he returned to New York and told Catherine everything, her face went white. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Years," Jonathan admitted. "Long before I met you. But that's not an excuse. I should have known. I should have been paying attention. I was so focused on profits and growth that I didn't care about the human cost." Catherine stood up from the couch, her arms wrapped around herself. "Children, Jonathan. You had children working in your factories, women being exploited and abused, and your response was going to be to pay them off and hide it." The accusation in her voice was like a knife to his chest. "No," he said desperately. "I mean, yes, that was my first instinct, but I didn't do it. I went there. I saw it. I shut it down. I'm fixing it." "You're fixing it now," Catherine said, and her voice was shaking. "Now that you've been caught, now that it's in the news. But if it hadn't come out, would you have ever looked? Would you have ever cared?" "That's not fair," Jonathan said, standing up. "I've changed." "You know I've changed." Catherine laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Have you? Or did you just learn how to play a different role? The reformed billionaire, the man who volunteers and cares and pretends to be one of the good guys. How do I know any of it was real, Jonathan? How do I know you weren't just playing a part to get what you wanted?" The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. "You can't believe that," he said. "Everything between us, everything we've built, it's real. I love you, Catherine. I've never loved anyone the way I love you." "Love," she said softly, and there were tears in her eyes now. "You say you love me, but you were running a company that exploited women and children. You say you've changed, but the second there was a crisis, your instinct was to cover it up and protect your wealth. Maybe you wanted to change, Jonathan. Maybe you even tried, but wanting isn't enough. Trying isn't enough. Either you are someone different, or you're not. And right now, I don't know which one is true." She grabbed her coat and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Jonathan asked, panic rising in his chest. "I need space," Catherine said. "I need to think about whether I can trust you, whether any of this was real, whether you're actually capable of being the man I thought you were becoming." She left, and Jonathan stood alone in the apartment that had become his home, feeling the world crumbling around him. The next 2 weeks were the worst of Jonathan's life. Catherine wouldn't see him, wouldn't take his calls, responded to his texts with brief, cold messages asking for more time. Meanwhile, the scandal exploded. The media seized on the story of Pierce Industries' labor violations, and Jonathan became the poster child for corporate greed and exploitation. His face was on every news channel, every website, every social media platform. Protesters showed up at his office building. Board members called for his resignation. Shareholders filed lawsuits. And through it all, the only thing Jonathan could think about was Catherine. He didn't care about the company or the money or his reputation. He cared that he'd disappointed her, that he'd proven her worst fears about him were justified, that he'd lost the one thing that actually mattered. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He made it right, not the easy way, not the corporate way, but the right way. He testified before Congress about the labor violations, providing documentation and evidence that implicated not just his company, but dozens of others. He established a fund to compensate the workers who'd been exploited. A real fund with real money, not some token gesture. He implemented new oversight policies across all of Pierce Industries' operations, bringing in independent monitors and giving them full authority. He took a pay cut, a massive one, diverting his salary to worker safety programs and fair wage initiatives. He faced the protesters instead of hiding from them, listening to their anger and their stories. He gave interviews not to spin or defend himself, but to admit his failures and his complicity. And he did it all knowing that it might not be enough, that Catherine might never forgive him, that he might lose her forever. But he did it anyway because it was right, because it was what she would do, because it was what the man he wanted to be would do. 3 weeks after their fight, Catherine showed up at his penthouse. He'd been staying there instead of her apartment, giving her space, and he opened the door to find her standing in the hallway, looking exhausted and uncertain. "I saw your testimony," she said without preamble. "I saw what you're doing at the company. Linda called me. She said you showed up at the foundation and wrote a check, a big one, with no strings attached. She said you looked terrible." Jonathan did look terrible. He'd lost weight, wasn't sleeping, was running on coffee and desperation. "I had to make it right," he said. "Not for you, or not just for you, but because it was right, because those workers deserved justice. Because I couldn't live with myself knowing that I'd built my fortune on their suffering." Catherine stepped into the apartment, and Jonathan closed the door behind her. They stood in the entryway, the silence heavy between them. "I've been thinking a lot," Catherine finally said. "About you, about us, about what I said that night. Some of it was true. Your first instinct was wrong. You did build a company that exploited people. You did spend most of your life being someone I would despise." Jonathan's heart sank, but she wasn't finished. "But here's what I realized. People aren't fixed, Jonathan. We're all changing, all the time, every day. The question isn't whether you were a terrible person. The question is whether you're willing to keep doing the hard work of being better. Whether you'll fall back into old patterns when things get difficult, or whether you'll keep fighting to be someone different." She took a step closer to him. "And watching you these past 3 weeks, seeing you face the consequences of your actions head on, seeing you prioritize doing the right thing over protecting yourself, I think I have my answer. You're not the man you were when we met. You're not even the man you were 3 weeks ago. You're someone who's trying, every single day, to be better, to do better, and that's all anyone can ask." Jonathan felt something break open in his chest, hope and relief and love flooding through him. "Does this mean you forgive me?" he asked. "Does this mean we can try again?" Catherine smiled, that beautiful, genuine smile that he'd missed so desperately. "It means I love you," she said. "The real you, with all your flaws and failures and mistakes. It means I believe you're trying to be better. And it means I want to be there with you, fighting to make the world better, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Jonathan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, feeling like he could finally breathe again. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I love you so much. And I promise, I will spend every day trying to deserve you, trying to be worthy of your faith in me." "You already are," Catherine whispered. "You just have to keep choosing it. Every single day, you have to keep choosing to be the person you want to be." That's what love is, Jonathan. It's not about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about choosing each other and choosing to be better, over and over again, even when it's terrifying. The rebuilding process was slow, painful, and more complicated than Jonathan had ever imagined. Pierce Industries faced lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and a complete restructuring that cost billions and took years. Jonathan's net worth dropped by 60% as he divested problematic operations, paid restitution to workers, and invested in ethical supply chain management. His former friends and business associates called him a fool, said he was destroying shareholder value, predicted the company would collapse within a year. The business press wrote think pieces about his spectacular fall from grace, analyzing what had gone wrong with the once brilliant CEO who'd lost his edge. But Jonathan didn't care about any of that anymore. He cared about the families in Bangladesh who were finally receiving fair wages and safe working conditions. He cared about the new oversight systems that were catching problems before they became crises. He cared about building a company that could look at itself in the mirror without shame. And most of all, he cared about Catherine, about being the kind of partner she deserved, about proving through his actions that his transformation was real and permanent. They moved forward together, stronger for having survived the crisis. Catherine helped him navigate the ethical complexities of corporate transformation, introducing him to labor rights activists, fair trade advocates, and workers, organizations who could help him rebuild Pierce Industries the right way. Jonathan threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd once devoted to profit maximization, but now his metrics were different. Instead of quarterly earnings, he measured worker satisfaction, safety records, and environmental impact. Instead of focusing solely on shareholder returns, he considered stakeholder welfare, the well-being of everyone touched by his company's operations. It was harder, more complex, and infinitely more rewarding than anything he'd done before. 6 months after they'd reconciled, on a Saturday morning at their usual diner in Queens, Jonathan reached across the table and took Catherine's hand. "Move in with me," he said. "Not to my penthouse. I'm actually selling that. I found a brownstone in Brooklyn, walking distance from the foundation's office. It has a garden, a real kitchen, space for us to build a life together. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to cook terrible dinners with you every night. I want to build something real with you." Catherine looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. "You're selling the penthouse?" she asked. "The symbol of everything you achieved." Jonathan smiled. "It was never a home. It was a trophy, something to show off to prove I'd made it. But I don't need to prove that anymore. I don't care about impressing people who don't matter. I care about building a life with you, about creating something meaningful. The penthouse was always empty, Catherine. You're what made me feel like I finally came home." Tears welled in her eyes, and she squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll move in with you. I'll build a life with you. I'll wake up next to you and cook terrible dinners with you, and probably argue with you about whether you're doing enough at the company." Jonathan laughed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They moved into the brownstone in Brooklyn a month later, and it quickly became everything the penthouse had never been. It was warm, lived in, full of books and plants and mismatched furniture that they'd picked out together. Catherine set up a home office where she could work on foundation business, and Jonathan converted one of the rooms into a workshop where he taught himself woodworking, finding satisfaction in creating things with his hands that had nothing to do with profit margins or stock prices. They hosted dinners for the foundation staff, filling the house with laughter and conversation, and the kind of genuine community that Jonathan had never experienced in all his years of networking events and business galas. Linda came to dinner once with her kids, and afterward, as Jonathan was cleaning up, she pulled him aside. "You know what's different about you?" she asked. When I first met you, I could tell you were someone important, someone used to being the smartest person in the room, but you were trying so hard to not let it show, and it made you seem almost uncomfortable in your own skin. Now you're just comfortable. You're not trying to be anyone other than who you are. It's nice to see." Jonathan thought about that conversation for days afterward. Linda was right. He'd spent so many years performing, playing the role of the ruthless CEO, the brilliant strategist, the man who always had the answers. Then he'd tried to perform a different role, the reformed philanthropist, the good guy. But somewhere along the way, with Catherine's help, he'd stopped performing altogether. He'd become someone real. Work at Pierce Industries continued to be challenging. The company lost market share to competitors who weren't constrained by ethical considerations, and there were quarters where profits dipped alarmingly. The board pressured Jonathan to cut corners, to find efficiencies that inevitably meant compromising on worker welfare or environmental standards. But Jonathan held firm, and gradually, something unexpected happened. Customers started noticing the changes. Young consumers, particularly millennials and Gen Z, began seeking out Pierce Industries products specifically because of the company's commitment to ethical manufacturing. Universities and nonprofits wanted to partner with them. Talented workers wanted to join a company that aligned with their values. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always smooth, but slowly, Pierce Industries became profitable again, this time building its success on a foundation of genuine ethics rather than exploitation. Jonathan proved that it was possible to run a successful business without sacrificing your humanity, without treating workers as disposable resources, without prioritizing profit above all else. It wasn't easy, and it required constant vigilance, but it was possible. And that realization changed everything for him. One evening, about a year after they'd moved in together, Jonathan came home to find Catherine sitting in the garden, reading a book in the fading sunlight. She looked up when she heard him, and the smile that spread across her face made his heart skip a beat, even after all this time. "So how was your day?" she asked, and Jonathan sat down beside her on the garden bench they'd bought at a flea market in Park Slope. "Frustrating," he admitted. "We found another supplier who was misrepresenting their labor practices. We have to cut ties and find an alternative, which is going to cost us and delay production on an entire product line. The board is furious." Catherine set down her book and took his hand. "But you're doing the right thing," she said. "You're holding the line. That matters more than one product line or one quarter's earnings." "I know," Jonathan said. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm being naive. If I'm fighting a battle I can never really win because the whole system is rigged against doing the right thing." "You probably are," Catherine said bluntly, and then smiled at his expression. "Fighting a battle you can't completely win. I mean, systemic change is hard, Jonathan. It takes decades, generations even. But that doesn't mean the fight isn't worth it. Every worker you protect, every standard you uphold, every company you pressure into doing better, it ripples out. It creates change. Maybe not as fast as we'd like, maybe not as completely as we'd hope, but it matters. You matter." Jonathan pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling grateful beyond words for this woman who challenged him and supported him and loved him even when he struggled. "I want to marry you," he said suddenly, the words coming out before he'd fully planned them. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you, fighting these battles together, building something that matters together." "I know I don't have a ring, and this isn't some romantic proposal, but I love you, Catherine Hayes, and I want to be your husband." Catherine pulled back to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise and then crinkling with amusement. That was possibly the least romantic proposal in history, she said. No ring, no plan, just blurting it out in the garden after complaining about work. Jonathan laughed, feeling suddenly nervous. "Ah, is that a no?" "It's a yes, you idiot," Catherine said, and kissed him. "It's a yes because that's who we are. We're not candlelight and roses and perfectly planned moments. We're garden benches and honest conversations, and choosing each other even when things are hard. So yes, Jonathan Pierce, I will marry you. I will fight beside you and challenge you and love you for the rest of our lives." They got married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the community center where Jonathan had first volunteered. Linda officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion, and the guests were a mix of foundation staff, former program participants, Jonathan's executive team who'd stuck with him through the transformation, and a handful of family members. There were no celebrities, no Society Pages coverage, no elaborate designer details. Catherine wore a simple white dress she'd found at a boutique in Park Slope, and Jonathan wore a suit he'd bought off the rack. But when they exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to support each other's growth, to challenge each other to be better, to never stop fighting for what was right, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. At the reception, which was catered by a local restaurant they loved, and featured a playlist Catherine had made of their favorite songs, Jonathan found himself standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching Catherine laugh with Linda and some of the other foundation staff. He thought about the man he'd been when they met, standing in that museum gallery, bored and disconnected, viewing the world as something to be controlled and conquered. He thought about how empty his life had been, despite all the wealth and power and success. And he thought about how completely Catherine had transformed him, not by trying to change him, but by showing him who he could be, who he wanted to be, who he was underneath all the performance and pretense. "You look happy," said a voice beside him, and Jonathan turned to find Victoria Chen, his chief operating officer and one of the few executives who'd supported him through the company's transformation. "I am," Jonathan said simply, "happier than I ever thought possible." Victoria smiled. "You know, when you first started making changes at the company, I thought you'd lost your mind. I thought you were having some kind of midlife crisis or breakdown. But watching you now, seeing what you and Catherine have built together, I get it. You didn't lose your mind, you found your soul." It was a cheesy thing to say, but it was also true. Catherine had helped him find parts of himself he'd buried or forgotten or never known existed. She'd helped him become someone he could respect when he looked in the mirror. As if sensing his thoughts, Catherine turned from her conversation and caught his eye across the room. She smiled, that smile that was just for him, and Jonathan felt his heart expand with love and gratitude and sheer wonder that this remarkable woman had chosen him, had believed in him, had loved him enough to push him to be better. He crossed the room to her, took her hand, and led her onto the dance floor. They swayed together to a song about second chances and new beginnings, and Jonathan whispered in her ear, "Thank you." "For what?" Catherine asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "For seeing something in me worth saving. For not giving up on me even when I gave you every reason to. For loving me enough to make me want to be better." Catherine pulled back to look at him, her eyes shining with tears and love and fierce determination. "You saved yourself, Jonathan. I just showed you the path. You did the hard work. You made the choices. You became the man you wanted to be. We did it together," Jonathan corrected. "We'll keep doing it together. That's what partners do." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "That's exactly what partners do." 5 years passed, years of continued growth and challenge and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful together. The Hayes Foundation expanded, opening satellite offices in 3 other cities and helping thousands of women rebuild their lives. Jonathan served on the board, using his business expertise to help Catherine scale the organization without losing its soul. Pierce Industries became a leader in ethical business practices, proving that profitability and principles didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Other companies started following their model, and Jonathan spent time consulting with CEOs who wanted to transform their operations but didn't know where to start. Catherine published a book about systemic change and grassroots organizing that became required reading in social work programs across the country. She gave talks at universities and conferences, inspiring a new generation of activists and advocates. And through it all, she and Jonathan supported each other, challenged each other, loved each other with a depth and constancy that only grew stronger with time. They had arguments, of course. Catherine thought Jonathan was still too willing to compromise with business interests, and Jonathan thought Catherine was sometimes too uncompromising, unwilling to take incremental progress when wholesale change wasn't possible. But they learned to navigate their disagreements with respect and honesty, to find common ground without sacrificing their core values. On their 5th anniversary, they took a trip to Bangladesh, visiting the factories that had once been sites of exploitation and were now models of fair labor practices. They met with workers who remembered the changes Jonathan had implemented, who told stories of how their lives had improved, how their children were going to school instead of working, how they finally earned enough to support their families with dignity. One woman, her name was Priya, and she was about Catherine's age, took Jonathan's hands in hers and said through a translator, "You gave us our humanity back. You saw us as people, not just resources. My daughter is going to university now. She's studying engineering. That would never have been possible before. Thank you." Jonathan felt tears streaming down his face, and Catherine squeezed his hand. Later, in their hotel room, he said to her, "That's what it's all about, isn't it? Not the profits or the prestige or even the systemic change, though that matters too. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, and treating them with the dignity they deserve. It's so simple, and yet I spent decades not understanding it." "You understand it now," Catherine said, "and you're teaching others to understand it too. That's your legacy, Jonathan. Not the money you made or the company you built, but the lives you changed and the example you set." A year later, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. They hadn't been trying, but they hadn't been preventing either, taking a whatever happens, happens approach that reflected their shared belief that life was unpredictable and trying to control everything was futile. When she told Jonathan, he felt a rush of emotion so intense he had to sit down. Fear, excitement, joy, terror, all swirling together in an overwhelming wave. "Are you okay?" Catherine asked, sitting beside him on their couch, her hand on his knee. "I'm terrified," Jonathan admitted. "What if I mess this up? What if I'm a terrible father? What if I pass on all my worst traits to this kid?" Catherine laughed softly. "Jonathan, you spent the first 40 years of your life learning to be a decent human being. I think you've got this. And besides, we'll figure it out together." We always do. Their daughter was born on a snowy January morning, 7 pounds or 3 ounces of perfect human being, who immediately had Jonathan wrapped around her tiny finger. They named her Grace, because Catherine said grace was about receiving something you didn't deserve and choosing to be grateful for it anyway. Grace was about second chances and transformation and love that changed you. And their daughter was all of those things, a living reminder of how far they'd come and what they'd built together. Jonathan took paternity leave, something that raised eyebrows in the business world, but that he refused to compromise on. He spent those first months learning to change diapers and give bottles and function on 3 hours of sleep. He sang off-key lullabies and read board books and marveled at every tiny milestone. And he thought about the kind of father he wanted to be, the kind of man he wanted his daughter to grow up knowing. He wanted to teach her about justice and compassion. He wanted to show her that success wasn't about how much money you made, but about how many lives you touched. He wanted her to understand that being powerful meant using that power to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Most of all, he wanted her to have the kind of parents he wished he'd understood earlier in life. Parents who modeled partnership and mutual respect, who showed her that love wasn't about possession or control, but about supporting each other's growth and fighting together for what mattered. As Grace grew from infant to toddler, Jonathan and Catherine fell into new rhythms. They took turns handling night wakings and daycare drop-offs. They baby-proofed the brownstone and filled it with toys and books and the cheerful chaos of early childhood. They brought Grace to the foundation sometimes, and she played in Catherine's office while her mother worked, growing up surrounded by strong women who were changing their lives and their communities. They brought her to Pierce Industries, too, and Jonathan's employees got used to seeing their CEO with a toddler on his hip during video calls or finger paintings on his desk. He refused to be the kind of father who prioritized work over family, who missed important moments because of meetings or travel. He'd learned the hard way what actually mattered, and he wasn't going to forget those lessons just because life got busy. When Grace was 3, she asked Jonathan what he did for work. They were sitting in the garden, reading stories before bedtime, and she looked up at him with Catherine's green eyes and said, "Daddy, what's your job?" Jonathan thought about how to explain it in terms a 3-year-old could understand. "I try to make sure that the people who work for my company are treated fairly and paid well and kept safe," he said. "I try to make sure we don't hurt the environment or take advantage of people. I try to do business in a way that helps people instead of hurting them." Grace nodded seriously. "Like Mommy helps people?" she asked. "Exactly like Mommy helps people," Jonathan said. "We're trying to make the world a little bit better, one decision at a time." "That's a good job," Grace pronounced, and went back to her story. Jonathan smiled, thinking about how far he'd come from the man who'd measured success in dollars and market share. Now he measured it in moments like this, in his daughter's simple approval, in the knowledge that he was building something worth passing down to the next generation. On Grace's 4th birthday, they threw a party in the garden with kids from her preschool and their parents. It was loud and chaotic and perfect, with a homemade cake that leaned slightly to one side and decorations from the dollar store. Jonathan watched Catherine orchestrating the chaos, making sure every kid felt included, turning a near disaster when the piñata broke early into a game that had all the children laughing. And he thought about the woman he'd met at that gala so many years ago, the woman who'd looked at him with contempt and challenged him to be better. She was still that person, still fierce and uncompromising in her values, still fighting every day to make the world more just. But she was also this, his partner, his wife, the mother of his child, the person who made him laugh and challenged him, and loved him with a constancy he'd never thought he deserved. That night, after Grace was asleep and they'd cleaned up the remnants of the party, Jonathan and Catherine sat in the garden under the stars. "Do you ever think about how things might have been different?" Catherine asked. "If I'd written you off completely that first night, if you hadn't shown up at the foundation, if you'd given up when things got hard." Jonathan considered this. "Sometimes," he admitted, "and it terrifies me. I think about who I was, who I would have stayed being, and it makes me sick. I was so lost, Catherine, so empty. I had everything and nothing at the same time." "But you changed," Catherine said. "That's what matters. You chose to change, and you keep choosing it, every single day." "Because of you," Jonathan said. "Because you showed me there was another way to live, another way to be." Catherine shook her head. "I showed you the door, Jonathan. You walked through it. You did the work. You made the choices. I'm proud of you. But you should be proud of yourself too. You earned this life, this happiness, this peace." Jonathan pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling grateful beyond words for this life they'd built, this family they'd created, this love that had transformed him so completely. "I love you," he said. "I will love you for the rest of my life. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "I love you too," Catherine said. Even though you're still sometimes a stubborn, arrogant pain in my ass," Jonathan laughed, especially because you're willing to tell me when I'm being a stubborn, arrogant pain in your ass. You keep me honest, Catherine. You keep me real." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something beautiful from the wreckage of his old life, who'd proven that transformation was possible if you were willing to do the hard work of becoming someone better. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, ancient and constant, bearing witness to this small moment of human happiness, this love story that had started with contempt and grown into something profound and lasting. Jonathan thought about the man he'd been, standing in that museum gallery, empty and lost despite all his wealth and power. He thought about the journey he'd taken, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned. And he thought about the life he had now, imperfect and challenging and infinitely precious. He'd tried to buy Catherine's love with donations and grand gestures and the performance of being someone better. But in the end, what won her heart wasn't his money or his power or even his transformation. It was his willingness to be vulnerable, to admit his failures, to keep trying even when he stumbled. It was his choice, made every single day, to be the kind of man who deserved her love. Not because he was perfect, but because he was committed to growing, to learning, to being better. That was the real story. Not about a billionaire who tried to buy love, but about a man who learned that the only thing worth having couldn't be bought at all. It could only be earned, slowly and painfully, through honesty and effort, and the constant work of becoming someone worthy of it. And Jonathan had done that work, was still doing that work, would keep doing that work for the rest of his life. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because Catherine and Grace deserved his best self. Because the world deserved people who tried to be better. Because he deserved to live with integrity and purpose and love. 10 years after Grace's birth, Jonathan found himself back at the Metropolitan Museum for their annual gala. He almost hadn't come. Memories of that first night still vivid in his mind, but Catherine had convinced him. The foundation was being honored for their work, and she wanted him there to share the moment. As Jonathan stood by the same marble columns where he'd first seen Catherine throw that glass of champagne, he marveled at how different everything was. He was different. The man who'd stood here 17 years ago had been empty, chasing the wrong things, measuring his worth by all the wrong metrics. That man had viewed people as transactions, the world as something to be conquered and controlled. The man standing here now understood that real power came from service, that real wealth was measured in relationships and impact, that real success meant living with integrity. He watched Catherine accept the Foundation's award, her speech powerful and challenging, pushing the wealthy audience to do more than write checks, to examine their own complicity in systems of oppression, to use their privilege to create real change. She hadn't softened over the years. If anything, she'd become more focused, more determined, more unwilling to compromise on her values. And Jonathan loved her for it, loved that she pushed him, challenged him, refused to let him slide back into complacency. After the ceremony, as they were leaving, a young woman approached them. She was in her mid-20s, professionally dressed, confident in a way that spoke of hard-won self-assurance. "Mrs. Pierce," she said tentatively, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to say thank you. 10 years ago, I came to the Hayes Foundation after leaving an abusive relationship. I had nothing, no money, no job prospects, just my 5-year-old son and a lot of trauma. Your organization helped me get back on my feet. You helped me find a job, get affordable housing, navigate the legal system. You saved my life." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, and she took the woman's hands. "What's your name?" she asked. "Nicole," the woman said. "Nicole Martinez. I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you. You personally met with me 3 times when I was struggling, when I wanted to give up and go back to my ex because being alone seemed too hard. You told me I was stronger than I thought. You were right. I remember you, Catherine said, and Jonathan could hear the emotion in her voice. You were so scared but so determined to make a better life for your son. How is he? He's 15 now, Nicole said, her face lighting up. He's doing great in school, plays soccer, wants to be an engineer, and I'm the regional manager for a tech company, making more money than I ever dreamed possible. None of that would have happened without you, without the foundation. So thank you. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. After Nicole left, Catherine turned to Jonathan, tears streaming down her face. That's why we do this, she said. That's why it all matters. One woman, one child, one life changed. And then that life goes on to change other lives, to be an example, to prove that transformation is possible. Jonathan pulled her close, remembering all the times Catherine had said exactly that to him. All the times she'd believed in his transformation when he'd struggled to believe in it himself. You change lives, he said. Every single day, you change lives. You changed mine. You changed Nicole's. You've changed thousands of people's lives. And the ripples of that will keep spreading long after we're gone. That's a legacy worth having, Catherine. That's what actually matters. They walked out of the museum together, hand in hand, and Jonathan thought about the full circle of it all. He'd met Catherine in this building, had been dismissed and challenged and forced to confront who he really was. And now, 17 years later, they were leaving together, partners in every sense, having built a life and a family and a legacy that mattered. The next morning, Jonathan woke early and went for a run through Prospect Park, something he'd started doing years ago as a way to clear his head and process his thoughts. As he ran, he thought about Nicole, about Linda, about Priya, and all the other lives he'd been able to touch through his work with Catherine and the foundation, through his transformation of Pierce Industries. He thought about Grace, now 13, and already showing signs of inheriting her mother's fierce commitment to justice. Just last week, she'd organized a protest at her school because the administration was cutting arts funding while spending money on new football equipment. She'd made signs, rallied her classmates, and presented a detailed budget proposal to the principal showing how they could fund both programs adequately. Watching her, Jonathan had felt pride so intense it made his chest ache. This was what it was all about. Not just changing your own life, but creating a legacy of change. Raising children who understood that they had a responsibility to make the world better. Building systems and organizations that would keep fighting for justice long after you were gone. When he got back to the brownstone, he found Catherine and Grace in the kitchen making breakfast. Well, Catherine was making breakfast, and Grace was sitting at the table doing homework and arguing with her mother about whether she should be allowed to go to a climate protest downtown next weekend. It's important, Mom, Grace was saying. The planet is literally dying, and adults aren't doing enough. My generation has to speak up. I'm not saying you can't go, Catherine said patiently, flipping pancakes. I'm saying you need to go with adult supervision, and you need to tell us exactly where you'll be, and check in regularly. You can be an activist and still be safe. You sound like Dad, Grace muttered, but there was affection in her voice. Your dad was a corporate raider who valued profit over people for most of his life, Catherine said. If I sound like current Dad, I'll take that as a compliment. If I sound like old Dad, we need to have a different conversation, Grace laughed, and Jonathan shook his head, amazed as always by Catherine's ability to be both firm and funny, to set boundaries while still encouraging their daughter's activist spirit. For the record, he said, announcing his presence, I think Grace should go to the protest, with supervision. She's right that her generation needs to speak up. We've made a mess of things, and they deserve a chance to fight for their future. Grace jumped up and hugged him, sweaty running clothes and all. Thanks, Dad. See, Mom, Dad gets it. Dad is also going to be the one supervising you at said protest, Catherine said dryly. Since he's so supportive of the cause, Jonathan smiled. I'd be happy to. I haven't been to a good protest in years. It'll be nice to get back to my activist roots, Catherine snorted. Your activist roots that started approximately 12 years ago. Those roots? Hey, 12 years is a decent amount of time, Jonathan protested. I'm practically a seasoned veteran. They ate breakfast together, the three of them, talking about Grace's school, about Catherine's upcoming cases, about Jonathan's plans to expand Pierce Industries, sustainable manufacturing initiatives. It was ordinary, this Sunday morning breakfast, nothing special or remarkable, but it was everything to Jonathan. This was the life he'd built, the family he'd created, the peace he'd found after so many years of chasing the wrong things. That afternoon, Jonathan went to his workshop in the basement, a space he'd carved out over the years for woodworking and other projects. He was building a bookshelf for Grace's room, something he'd promised her months ago and was finally finishing. As he sanded the wood, breathing in the smell of sawdust and varnish, he thought about his father. His dad had been a teacher, had spent 40 years shaping young minds for a salary that barely covered the bills. Jonathan had spent so many years looking down on that, thinking his father had settled, had lacked ambition, had wasted his potential by not pursuing wealth and power. But now, as a father himself, as someone who'd learned what actually mattered, Jonathan understood. His father had been rich in all the ways that counted, rich in relationships, in purpose, in the knowledge that he'd made a difference in countless students' lives, rich in integrity, in consistency, in the respect of his community. The money Jonathan had spent decades accumulating, the power he'd wielded so ruthlessly, none of it had brought him a fraction of the satisfaction his father must have felt every day, going to work knowing he was shaping the future. Jonathan wished his father was still alive so he could tell him that, so he could apologize for his years of arrogance and misplaced priorities, so he could say thank you for the example he'd set even when Jonathan had been too blind to see it. But his father had died 8 years ago, had met Catherine and Grace but hadn't lived to see Jonathan's full transformation. Still, Jonathan liked to think his dad would be proud of who he'd become, of the choices he was making, of the legacy he was building. As he finished the bookshelf and carried it upstairs to Grace's room, Catherine appeared in the doorway. "It's beautiful," she said, running her hand over the smooth wood. "You've gotten really good at this." "It's meditative," Jonathan said. "Creating something with my hands, something that has nothing to do with business or profit, something that's just about making something useful and beautiful for our daughter." Catherine smiled. "You're a good father, Jonathan. I hope you know that. Grace is lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Jonathan said. "I'm lucky you gave me a chance when I didn't deserve it. Lucky you pushed me to be better. Lucky I get to watch Grace grow up into this amazing, passionate, brilliant person. Lucky I get to spend my life with you, fighting for things that matter. I never knew I could be this happy, Catherine. I never knew life could feel this full." Catherine crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. "You earned this," she said firmly. "You did the work. You changed. You keep changing. Keep growing. Keep trying to be better. That's not luck, Jonathan. That's choice. That's effort. That's love." They stood like that for a long moment. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something beautiful from the wreckage of his old life, who'd proven that transformation wasn't just possible but sustainable if you were willing to keep choosing it every single day. 20 years after that first night at the Metropolitan Museum, Jonathan Pierce stood at his daughter's high school graduation, watching Grace walk across the stage to receive her diploma. She'd been accepted to Columbia University with a full scholarship, planning to study social justice and environmental law. She wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps but carve her own path, fighting for climate justice and indigenous rights. As Jonathan watched her accept her diploma, confident and radiant in her cap and gown, he felt Catherine squeeze his hand. They'd done this. Together, they'd raised this remarkable young woman who understood that privilege came with responsibility, that power should be used to protect the vulnerable, that love was action, not just feeling. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and celebrations, a man approached Jonathan. He was in his 60s, well-dressed but not ostentatious, and there was something familiar about his face. "Jonathan Pierce?" the man asked, extending his hand. "I'm Thomas Crawford. We've never met, but I wanted to introduce myself." "I was Gerald Hutchinson's business partner for 20 years. Jonathan felt Catherine tense beside him. Gerald Hutchinson, the man Catherine had humiliated at that first gala, the man whose behavior had inadvertently brought Jonathan and Catherine together. "I heard Gerald passed away last year," Jonathan said carefully. "I'm sorry for your loss." Thomas nodded. "Thank you. Gerald and I had a complicated relationship. We built a successful company together, but we had very different values. I actually wanted to tell you something, and I think your wife should hear it too." He turned to Catherine. "You probably don't remember me, Mrs. Pierce, but I was at the Met Gala 20 years ago when you threw champagne in Gerald's face. I was standing about 10 feet away, and I saw the whole thing. What you did that night, standing up for your assistant, calling out Gerald's behavior, it changed something for me." Catherine looked surprised. "Changed what?" she asked. Thomas smiled sadly. "I'd watched Gerald harass women for years, staff, colleagues, strangers at parties, and I'd done nothing. I'd told myself it wasn't my business, that it wasn't my place to intervene, that confronting him would make things awkward or damage our business relationship. But watching you, this woman who barely knew the victim, risk social embarrassment and confrontation to do the right thing. It made me realize I was a coward, that my silence made me complicit." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And a week after that gala, I went to Gerald and told him his behavior was unacceptable. I told him that if he didn't get help and change, I was ending our partnership. He was furious, accused me of betraying him, said I was throwing away millions over political correctness. And you know what I did? You ended the partnership," Jonathan said, seeing where this was going. "I ended the partnership," Thomas confirmed. I walked away from a company I'd spent 20 years building because I couldn't be complicit anymore. It cost me, financially and socially. Gerald spent the rest of his life bad-mouthing me to anyone who'd listen. But I could finally look at myself in the mirror, and over the years, I built a new company with new partners who shared my values. It's been more successful and more fulfilling than anything Gerald and I ever did together." Catherine's eyes were shining with tears. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. "I sometimes wonder if the individual fights matter, if one confrontation or one stand actually changes anything. It's nice to know that sometimes it does." Thomas shook his head. "It's not just me, Mrs. Pierce. Do you know how many people were at that gala? How many of them saw what you did, saw your courage and your conviction? I've heard your name come up in conversations over the years, heard people talk about the Hayes Foundation and the work you do. You've inspired more people than you realize. You certainly inspired your husband." He turned back to Jonathan. "I've followed your career, Mr. Pierce. Your commitment to ethical business practices, your advocacy work. You've become someone worth admiring, someone who proves that change is possible. That's rare in our world. Most people either start out good or stay bad. You started one way and became something completely different. That takes courage and humility and a willingness to admit when you're wrong." "I respect that." Jonathan felt humbled by the words. "I had a good teacher," he said, looking at Catherine. "She showed me what actually matters. What's worth fighting for, who I could be if I was willing to do the work." Grace appeared then, diploma in hand, her face flushed with excitement. "Dad, Mom, they want to take graduation photos. Are you coming?" She looked at Thomas curiously. "Oh, I'm sorry. Am I interrupting?" "Not at all," Thomas said warmly. "Congratulations on your graduation. Your parents should be very proud." We are, Catherine and Jonathan said in unison, and Grace rolled her eyes affectionately. You're both so embarrassing. Come on, the photographer is waiting. As they walked toward the photo area, Jonathan thought about Thomas's words, about the ripples of Catherine's courage spreading out over 20 years, inspiring strangers to make different choices, to be better. It was exactly what Catherine had always told him, that change wasn't about grand gestures, but about individual choices that accumulated and spread, and created something larger than any one person. The photographer posed them in various configurations. Jonathan and Catherine with Grace, all three of them together, Grace alone with her diploma. As the camera flashed, Jonathan remembered another photo from 20 years ago, a picture from that first gala that had run in the society pages. In that photo, he'd looked confident, powerful, and completely empty. The man in that photograph had been a shell, performing success without understanding what success actually meant. The man standing here now, his arm around his wife and daughter, his heart full of love and purpose and gratitude, was real in a way that man had never been. That evening, they had a celebration dinner at their favorite restaurant in Brooklyn, the same place they'd been going for years. It was nothing fancy, just good food and warm atmosphere and the comfort of familiar surroundings. They invited Linda and her family, some of Grace's friends, a few colleagues from the foundation. It was loud and joyful, and exactly the kind of celebration Grace wanted, surrounded by people who'd watched her grow up and supported her journey. During dinner, Linda stood up to make a toast. "I've known Grace since she was a baby," she said, her voice warm with affection. "I've watched her grow into this brilliant, passionate, stubborn young woman who reminds me so much of both of her parents. Catherine, she has your fire and your commitment to justice. Jonathan, she has your strategic mind and your ability to see solutions where others see obstacles." She turned to Grace. "But you're also entirely your own person, with your own vision for how to make the world better. You've grown up watching your parents fight for what's right, watching them make hard choices, watching them prove that one person, or two people working together, can actually make a difference. You've learned from them, but you're going to make your own path, and I can't wait to see where that path takes you." "To Grace! To Grace!" everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Grace blushed, embarrassed by the attention, but clearly pleased. Later, after most of the guests had left, and it was just family sitting around the table, Grace looked at her parents seriously. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," Catherine replied. "Anything." "How did you two actually meet?" Grace asked. I know the basic story, that Dad was this rich businessman and Mom was running the foundation, but what really brought you together? You're so different, from such different worlds. What made you fall in love?" Jonathan and Catherine exchanged a look, a whole conversation happening in that glance. "Your mother threw a glass of champagne in a man's face," Jonathan said, and Grace's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" "Mom, you assaulted someone." "He was sexually harassing my assistant," Catherine said dryly, "and it was justified. Your father was standing nearby, pretending not to notice like everyone else at that fancy party. I called him out on it. She told me I was like every other rich man she'd met," Jonathan continued, "that I viewed people as transactions, that I cared more about my wealth and status than about doing what was right. And she was completely correct. I was exactly what she said I was. So how did you go from her hating you to this?" Grace gestured at them, at their obvious love and partnership. Jonathan smiled. "I tried to prove her wrong. And in trying to prove her wrong, I actually became different. Your mother didn't fall in love with who I was. She helped me become someone worth loving. Someone I could respect when I looked in the mirror." "That's not entirely true," Catherine interjected. "I saw something in you from the beginning, even when I didn't want to admit it. You were willing to listen, willing to admit when you were wrong, willing to change. Those are rare qualities, especially in someone who's been successful enough that they don't think they need to change. So yes, you transformed yourself. But the capacity for that transformation was already there. I just helped you find it. Grace absorbed this, thinking, "So love isn't just about finding the right person," she said slowly. "It's about both people being willing to grow and change and become better versions of themselves." "That's exactly right," Jonathan said. "Love is a choice you make every day. It's choosing to support each other's growth even when it's uncomfortable. It's being willing to be challenged and to challenge each other. It's building something together that's bigger than either of you alone." "Your father tried to buy my love at first," Catherine added with a smile. "Anonymous donations, volunteering at the foundation to get close to me, all these grand gestures. And none of it worked because I didn't want his money or his performance. I wanted his truth. I wanted him to be real with me, vulnerable, willing to admit his failures and his fears. That's what actually won me over. Not the wealth or the power or the gestures, but the moments when he let down his guard and showed me who he really was underneath all the armor." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad you found each other," she said. "I'm glad you both were brave enough to take that chance, because if you hadn't, I wouldn't be here. And the world would have one less amazing couple fighting to make things better." Jonathan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "We're glad too," he said. "You are the best thing we ever created, Grace. Better than any business or non-profit or legacy. You are our proudest achievement." "No pressure or anything," Grace joked, but her eyes were bright with tears. They sat together as the restaurant slowly emptied around them, talking about Grace's plans for college, about Catherine's upcoming cases, about Jonathan's latest initiative at Pierce Industries to eliminate all single-use plastics from their supply chain. They talked about Grace's boyfriend, Tyler, who was going to Berkeley, and about whom Grace had complicated feelings. They talked about the state of the world, about politics and climate change and social justice movements. And through it all, Jonathan felt this deep sense of contentment, this knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the people he was meant to be with, doing exactly what mattered most. He thought about the question that had haunted him for years after he met Catherine. Could someone really change? Could someone who'd spent decades being selfish and ruthless and focused on all the wrong things actually become someone different? Someone better? The answer, he now knew, was yes. But only if you were willing to do the work. Only if you had someone who believed in your capacity for change and held you accountable. Only if you were humble enough to admit your failures and brave enough to try again when you stumbled. 3 months later, as Jonathan helped Grace move into her dorm room at Columbia, he thought about all the moments that had led to this one. The champagne thrown in anger, the volunteer shifts at the foundation, the crisis that almost destroyed everything, the slow building of trust and love, the wedding, the brownstone, the birth of their daughter, 20 years of choices, of growth, of learning what actually mattered. "You're being emotional again," Grace said, noticing his misty eyes as they finished setting up her room. "I'm allowed to be emotional," Jonathan protested. "My daughter is starting college. This is a big moment." "It's not like I'm disappearing," Grace said, but she hugged him tightly. "I'm just across town. I'll be home for dinner at least once a week. You'll probably get sick of me." "Never," Jonathan said firmly. "I will never get sick of you. You are the best part of my life, Grace. You and your mother. Everything else is just details." Catherine appeared in the doorway, having finished helping Grace's roommate move in. "Are we having a moment?" she asked with a smile. "Because if we are, I want in on it." She joined the hug, and the three of them stood there in Grace's tiny dorm room, holding each other, marking this transition, this next chapter. "I love you both so much," Grace said, her voice muffled against Jonathan's shoulder. "Thank you for being the kind of parents who actually show up, who actually care, who taught me what matters." I know I'm lucky. A lot of my friends, their parents are either absent or controlling or so focused on success that they forget to just be human. You two always stayed human. It was perhaps the greatest compliment Grace could have given, and Jonathan felt it land deep in his chest. They'd stayed human. Despite the wealth and the power and the demands of their work, they'd never lost sight of what actually mattered. They'd raised their daughter in love and honesty, teaching her by example how to live with integrity and purpose. As they left Grace's dorm and walked through Columbia's campus, Jonathan took Catherine's hand. "We did good," he said. "We raised an amazing kid. We built something real." "We did," Catherine agreed. "But the work's not done. She still needs us, just in different ways. And there's still so much work to do in the world. So many women to help, so many systems to change, so many battles to fight. I wouldn't want to fight them with anyone else," Jonathan said. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, two people who'd been through so much together, who'd built a life on the foundation of honesty and mutual challenge and deep, abiding love. As they reached the subway station, Catherine stopped and turned to face him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up the life you had before, the penthouse, the power, the respect of the business world? You could have been one of the richest men in America if you'd stayed on that path. Instead, you chose ethics and fairness and me. Do you ever wonder what might have been?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Never," he said firmly. "That life was empty, Catherine. I had everything and nothing. I was lost and didn't even know it. You saved me. Not from poverty or failure, but from a life without meaning, without purpose, without love. You showed me what actually matters. And everything I gave up, all the money and status and power, it was nothing compared to what I gained. You, Grace, a life I'm proud of, work that matters. The ability to look at myself in the mirror and see someone I actually respect." Catherine smiled. That beautiful smile that still made his heart skip after 20 years. "Good answer," she said. "But you know what? You saved yourself, Jonathan. I just showed you the path. You walked it. You did the work. You made the choices. Don't give me all the credit for your transformation." "We saved each other," Jonathan said. "We made each other better. That's what love is supposed to do. It's supposed to challenge you and support you and push you to become the best version of yourself. You did that for me, and I hope I did that for you too." "You did," Catherine said softly. "You do. Every single day, you make me want to be better, to do more, to love more deeply. That's your gift, Jonathan. Not your money or your business acumen, but your capacity for growth. Your willingness to keep changing, keep learning, keep becoming more fully yourself." They descended into the subway, joining the flow of humanity, moving through New York City. Just two more people in the endless stream of lives and stories and journeys. But to Jonathan, this ordinary moment felt profound. This was his life now. Not penthouses and private cars and exclusive galas, but subways and ordinary people and the beautiful complexity of real life. That night, back in their brownstone in Brooklyn, Jonathan and Catherine sat in the garden under the stars. The house felt too quiet without Grace, her absence a reminder that time kept moving forward, that nothing stayed the same forever. "Empty nest syndrome hitting you hard?" Catherine asked, reading his mood. "A little," Jonathan admitted. "I know she's just across town. I know she needs this independence. But I miss her already. I miss the noise and the chaos and even the arguments about curfews and screen time." Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder. "Me too, but this is good for her. And it's good for us too. We get to remember who we are as a couple, not just as parents. We get to have adventures that don't revolve around school schedules and teenage drama." "What kind of adventures?" Jonathan asked. "I don't know," Catherine said. "Maybe we finally take that trip to India we've been talking about. Or we could start volunteering together at the new foundation branch in Los Angeles. Spend a few months out there helping them get established. Or we could just sleep in on Saturdays and have long, lazy breakfasts without anyone rushing us." "All of that sounds perfect," Jonathan said. They sat in comfortable silence, and Jonathan thought about the incredible journey of the past 20 years. He thought about the man he'd been, arrogant and empty and lost. He thought about the crisis that had almost destroyed everything, the moment when he'd had to choose between his old self and his new one. He thought about all the small moments that had built this life, the conversations and compromises and choices that had brought them to this place. And he thought about the future, about growing old with Catherine, about watching Grace build her own life and career, about the grandchildren who might one day play in this garden. He thought about the continued work at Pierce Industries and the Hayes Foundation, about the lives they would keep changing and the systems they would keep challenging. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be setbacks and failures and moments of doubt. But they would face it all together, as partners, as equals, as two people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other through everything life threw at them. "Catherine," he said quietly. "Yes. Thank you." "For what?" "For despising me when we met, for not letting me buy your affection, for challenging me to be better, for seeing something in me worth saving, for loving me through all my failures and transformations, for giving me grace, for building this life with me, for everything." Catherine lifted her head and kissed him softly. "You're welcome," she said. "But thank you too, for being willing to change, for doing the work, for becoming someone I could love without compromising my values, for being a true partner in this fight to make the world better, for loving me and our daughter with your whole heart, for proving that transformation is possible." They kissed again, deeper this time, with all the passion and tenderness of 20 years together. And as they sat there in their garden, under the stars, two people who'd found each other against all odds, Jonathan Pierce understood with perfect clarity what he'd learned over these past 2 decades. You can't buy love. You can't purchase transformation or pay for authenticity or acquire someone's heart like it's just another asset in your portfolio. Real love, lasting love, transformative love, it only comes when you're willing to be vulnerable, to admit your failures, to do the hard work of becoming someone worthy of it. It only comes when you stop performing and start being real. It only comes when you let someone see all of you, the good and the bad, the successes and the failures, and you trust them to love you anyway. It only comes when you're willing to be challenged and changed, when you're brave enough to let someone push you to be better than you are. Catherine had despised him when they met. She'd seen through his wealth and power to the emptiness underneath. She'd challenged him, refused him, forced him to confront who he really was, and in doing so, she'd given him the greatest gift anyone had ever given him, the chance to become someone he could respect, someone she could love, someone who actually deserved the incredible life they'd built together. He couldn't buy that. He couldn't purchase it or acquire it or add it to his portfolio. He could only earn it, slowly and painfully, through honesty and effort and the constant work of choosing to be better. And that's exactly what he'd done. That's what he would keep doing, every single day, for the rest of his life. Because Catherine Hayes, the woman who'd thrown champagne in a predator's face and called out Jonathan's complicity, the woman who'd built an organization from nothing to help women find their strength, the woman who'd loved him enough to push him to be better, she deserved nothing less than his very best self. And Jonathan Pierce, former corporate raider turned ethical businessman, volunteer, father and husband, he was finally, after 20 years of work, becoming that person. Not perfect, never perfect, but real, authentic, constantly growing, constantly trying, constantly choosing love and integrity and purpose over the easy path. That was enough. That had to be enough. And standing there in his garden, holding the love of his life, knowing his daughter was out there beginning her own journey, knowing he'd built something that mattered. Jonathan knew with absolute certainty that it was more than enough. It was everything. So here's what I want you to understand. This wasn't really a story about a billionaire trying to buy love. It was a story about a man who had to lose everything he thought mattered to find what actually did. It was about a woman who refused to compromise her values, even when it would have been easier, even when it would have been more profitable, even when people told her she was too demanding, too uncompromising, too much. It was about the courage to change when change seems impossible, the humility to admit when you're wrong, the strength to keep trying when you fail, and the grace to accept love when you finally become someone worthy of it. Jonathan Pierce spent 40 years of his life chasing money and power, believing they would fill the emptiness inside him. They never did. He spent months trying to buy Catherine's affection with donations and grand gestures and the performance of being someone better. That didn't work either. What finally won her heart was the simplest and hardest thing of all: truth, vulnerability, the willingness to be seen, fully and completely, with all his flaws and failures exposed. The courage to do the hard work of transformation, not because it would get him what he wanted, but because it was right, because it made him someone he could respect, because Catherine deserved his best self, and so did the world. And Catherine, she taught him the most important lesson of all: that love isn't something you have or possess or control. Love is something you earn and nurture and choose every single day through your actions and your integrity and your willingness to keep growing. 20 years later, Jonathan Pierce is not the man he was when this story began. He's not even the man he was last year, because he's still changing, still learning, still becoming more fully himself. That's the real story. Not about a dramatic transformation from villain to hero, but about the daily, unglamorous work of choosing to be better, of staying human even when the world pushes you to be something else, of loving someone enough to let them push you beyond your comfort zone, of building a life that matters, not because it's impressive or wealthy or powerful, but because it's real. So when you leave this story, don't leave with the idea that transformation is easy, or that love conquers all, or that one person can completely change another. Leave with this: change is possible, but only if you're willing to do the work. Love is real, but only if you're brave enough to be vulnerable. Happiness is attainable, but only if you stop measuring it in the wrong currency. And the only thing you can't buy, the only thing that money and power will never get you, is the one thing that actually matters: a life lived with integrity, purpose, and love. Jonathan Pierce learned that the hard way. Catherine Hayes taught it to him with fierce compassion and uncompromising standards. And together, they built something that proved it was true, not a fairy tale, not a perfect ending, just two imperfect people choosing each other and choosing to be better, over and over again, one day at a time. That's the story. That's the answer to the question that started all of this. He could buy anything in this world: private islands, Fortune 500 companies, politicians, silence, but he couldn't buy the one thing he needed most: the heart of a woman who saw through all his armor to the scared, empty man underneath, the respect of a daughter who judged him not by his wealth, but by his integrity, the peace that comes from looking in the mirror and seeing someone you actually respect. Those things can't be bought. They can only be earned. And Jonathan Pierce, with Catherine Hayes by his side, spent 20 years earning them. That's not just his story. That's the story of anyone who's ever had to unlearn what the world taught them about success and power and value. Anyone who's ever been brave enough to admit they were wrong and try again. Anyone who's ever loved someone enough to let them change them. Maybe it's your story too. Or maybe it will be. Because the only thing more powerful than money, more lasting than power, more valuable than any achievement or acquisition, is the courage to become who you were always meant to be, and to love someone who helps you get there. That's what Jonathan learned. That's what Catherine taught. That's what their daughter inherited. And that's what this story, at its heart, was always about. Not buying love, but earning it. Not possessing someone, but growing with them. Not controlling your life, but having the courage to let it transform you. That's the real power. That's the real wealth. That's the real success. Everything else is just noise.